billion in the second year for a total of 2.4 billion. Some of the the first item on the list, I'll go by the table, is the rebenchmarking number. Rebenchmarking is lower this year. It's 29.1 million over the biennium. This is because of lower student enrollment. We had lower cost in fiscal year 20, which is the base data for rebenchmarking. But you see on line 2, the governor proposes a hold harmless for those rebenchmarking data anomalies, and I have a later slide that'll detail what those 3 components are in that. But that cost about $355 million over the biennium to hold the divisions harmless for any rebenchmarking data that was wonky because of 2020 fiscal year. You see the $158 million reduction in the sales tax for food, or on food for human consumption. This is the groceries tax. This is the state's 1% reduction, and that is the net reduction to the school divisions. So this would be what the school divisions would have to come up with, the 45 and the 112 in the second year. But on the next line, you see the governor has proposed a hold harmless, that's one time, to give the 45 and 112 million, so a total of 158 million over the biennium to hold the divisions harmless, so they do not have to find
Senator
local
Norman.
revenue.
Following up on Jennifer's question.
Your microphone.
Yeah,
Microphone's-
get a little closer here.
Following up on Jennifer's question, sort of, has any of that been looked at by school division? Because there's certainly going to be a disproportionality of the impact. And I realize in year 1 there's basically a save harmless, but that doesn't necessarily help in years going out. And so if that happens to be available by divisions, it may be helpful, because right now I think they are struggling a little bit to try to project out what the impact will be. And yes, they've got a blessing of 1 year, but it at least would give them an opportunity to anticipate maybe what the impact will be.
Yes.
Thank you.
Senator Norman, there is a distribution table by divisions, and it shows the impact in the second year, so they would be able to look at that going forward on there. And I can share that with you as well. Yes. The next line down is the 5% salary increase. This is $751 million over the biennium for a 5% salary increase in the first year and in the second year. And I have a slide detailing more of the details on that. There's $500 million in the first year for school construction grants. This is modeled after the program that was prior to the recession that the General Assembly had to give school construction grants. I have a later slide on that. There's almost $69 million to increase the at-risk add-on percentage. This is the funding directed towards school divisions with increased students who are at risk. This is another supplementing the literary funds for general funds. This is $166 million to pay for those school employee retirement costs with general funds. There's the expansion of the early reading programs to grades 4 and 5. We have seen decreases in our reading scores statewide, and so that is one reason that is in here. There's $27.4 million for the rebenchmarking of the VPI per pupil. This just keeps the per pupil amount to VPI increasing over time, similar to how we do other K-12 funding. There's $20.2 million to increase the number of instructors for English language learners. There's $19.4 million to continue expansion of our preschool program to at-risk 3-year-olds. This would provide about 2,500 more slots by the end of the second year of the preschoolers we're supporting in public school settings or in settings in private providers. The next line is to maintain the fiscal year 2022 VRS rates. This is $146 million. The reason you're seeing this is during rebenchmarking, the Department of Education updated the VRS rates based on what the board approved in October, but the governor's budget proposes maintaining the VRS rates at the fiscal year 2022, and so that adds that money back in to pay for that. The next line is $7.2 million to provide the full cost of competing adjustment to Accomack, Northampton counties. Cost of competing adjustment is currently only fully provided to the Planning District 8 divisions, and then some of the surrounding divisions of that planning district receive a quarter of that adjustment. This was a similar proposal last year that the conference budget took a different action. The next line is 3.4 for the increased mixed delivery preschool community provider add-on grants. This is just increasing preschool delivery with private providers using public dollars and providing additional dollars to recognize increased cost. There's $2.8 million for the state-operated programs in the children's hospitals. The Department of Education runs or provides education to any student who's in one of the children's hospitals, and that is to update it for CHKD and VCU's Children's Hospital for coming on board. And then there's $50 million over the biennium for supplemental programs. Those are those programs that go to nonprofits who provide some sort of educational assistance to K-12.
Thank you, sir. Going back to the 27.5 million on the
Yes.
Virginia Preschool Initiative, is that going to be distributed across the board, or can it be more targeted? If you look at some of the scores that schools that remained in person, there can be a substantial disparity between the performance there as opposed to those schools that did a majority of remote participation where there was a precipitous fall off. And so I'm just wondering, is there opportunity to target that money towards the lower performing school districts?
Senator Norman, it currently is not structured that way. It's structured taking how many at-risk 5-year-olds and calculating how
Nobody
many
may
slots.
agree with me, but
Right.
can you kind of take a look at that?
Yes, I will take note of that, Senator. Okay. This is, on slide 9, is just the rebenchmarking cost that gets you to the 29.1 million over the biennium. There's the updating of student enrollment. There still are some costs, even though you have fewer students, you still have to pay for the students you do have. The updating prevailing cost data is 177 million, but it is lower than what it probably would have been in a normal rebenchmarking. There's removal of one-time items, updating the LCI for the next biennium, updating the VRS fringe benefit rates. You see the cost of that decision at DOE to remove it, and then the governor having to add it back in during his budget development. You see the updating for the lottery proceeds. Lottery proceeds are projected to increase throughout the biennium by about 148 million, but that is still something that is unsure and unknown, and we will need to monitor that. And then you see the updating for the sales tax projection before any of the other policy changes, the elimination of the grocery sales tax being that one.
So, just wondered, when we've done hold harmless and hold harmless and hold harmless, and you re-benchmark, are those changing the re-benchmarking numbers, or are they changing the hold harmless numbers? In other words, are you getting a double dip because you're benchmarking and you're holding harmless?
Senator Newman, no. So usually hold harmlesses are removed before they start re-benchmarking. It's typically seen as a one-time spending item. And then for the no-loss funding that is currently in fiscal year 22, budget language requires it to be updated for any technical updates because you have increased sales tax distributions to the division. So it accounts for when a division gets more because something else changed in another program. So this slide 10 just details the sales tax policy changes, and at the bottom line shows you that the total net impact to the divisions during the current biennium is $0, but then that is only one time. So the elimination of the grocery sales tax, there would be something in the 2024-2026 biennium, like Senator Norman pointed out. Moving on to slide number 11, this relates to school construction. I mentioned the school construction grants. There's $500 million for construction and modernization grants. Each division receives a base allocation of $1 million. And then the remaining funds after the $1 million is distributed to each division is based on March fiscal year 2022 ADM, and that is weighted by LCI. So it's weighted based on the number of students who are fully funded by the state based on LCI. School divisions can use these for school construction, addition, infrastructure, site acquisition. Note, I want to point out they can also use it for debt service payments on school projects completed within the last 10 years. So if they've done something, they can use these funds to pay off that debt service, or you go towards that. And then any unspent funds can carry forward into fiscal year 24 and into fiscal year 25. So it goes into the next budget, or this local governing body can keep them.
Mr. Chairman,
Yeah. Senator.
I just want to make sure that these grants cannot be used for new schools, for consolidation and then a new school.
Did you say, Senator Howard, that it can't or it can't?
It can't, either way, but can it be used?
It could be.
For
The language is fairly flexible on eligible expenditures. If they want to consolidate schools and build a new one, would be allowed.
That would be okay
Yeah.
in this, okay. But not the federal.
Senator Howe, I will have to get an answer on that one before I say something on that. The next bullet just shows you the supplanting of the literary funds, making sure we're using general funds for teacher retirement instead of diverting from the literary fund. And then that gets you to the last bullet, because you return the literary fund to be a revolving door for construction loans or subsidy grants by allowing the Board of Education to award up to $200 million in construction loans or subsidy grants, subject to availability of those funds. And that really, they're revolving, so the school divisions will pay back the loans to the literary fund, and so you can give out more funds. And then that gets to the second slide on school construction. The budget includes language which implements recommendations from the Board of Education, or the Department of Education and Treasury, to make the literary fund a more competitive and attractive option. This would supersede statute and regulation to increase the maximum loan amount from $7.5 million to $25 million. There's probably not a school today that could be built with $7.5 million. It would establish loan interest rates based on the market index. So Treasury would be responsible for helping the Department of Education to benchmark them to whatever the market is feeling. Currently, they're setting code or regulation, and there's not much flexibility. So school divisions don't come to the literary fund for those loans. It would allow the Board of Education to eliminate the current waiting list. So you could have an open enrollment process to allow school divisions who are ready to go to construction to come for those loans. You would allow offering a loan add-on of about $5 million, so from $25 to $30 million for total project cost if projects would result in school consolidation, Senator House. So there is some add-on money available to divisions wanting to do that. And then there's incentive grants for the loan closing cost, so not to exceed $25,000 per loan. The next slide just details the 5% salary increase each year. This requires a local match based on LCI, so divisions have to provide a local match. Divisions can receive a prorated share if they provide an increase less than 5%, but at least 2.5%. But to access the funds in the second year, the school divisions must provide a minimum 2.5% salary increase in both fiscal year 23 and 24. And that is the salary increase. Are there any questions on that before I move on? Okay. Slide 14 details the hold harmless rebenchmarking data. It's the state's share of basic aid and special education payments to hold divisions harmless. Special education students are lower because of rebenchmarking and just the pandemic. And so it would use either the higher of the December 2019 count or the December 2020 count for each school division. It would project out the final quarter of fiscal year 20 per pupil transportation costs. There were fewer transportation costs because schools were closed in the end of 2020. And then it would use the 2020-2022 biennium non-personnel support cost. Some of those decrease because you're schools were closed for about 3 months, so there was no cost for those, and it would instead use the 2022 and 2022 for those things that decreased. Those payments are set for the biennium with no subsequent technical updates, and the divisions still must also match those with the LCI. Slide number 15, this is just a slide that tries to put together all of the early childhood actions. In total, it's about $69 million over the biennium in additional early childhood money. The three first lines I've already explained, but the three last ones I was going to briefly touch on. There's $10 million to expand the Early Childhood Educator Incentive Grant. This is a $2,000 grant given to early childhood teachers to retain them, and UVA has determined that it actually does retain early childhood teachers in the field. There's an establish of a Grow Your Own Early Childhood Educator Grant. School divisions would work with higher ed institutions to grow their existing staff who may be a paraprofessional into becoming licensed to be an early childhood educator. And then there's an expansion of the Virginia Early Childhood Foundation's Mixed Delivery Grant Program that provides public funds to private providers who are providing child care. There's some language that would allow state support to be prorated for any late early childhood enrollment in VPI classrooms. It would align eligibility required for our VPI programs with all mixed delivery preschool programs, so there's not differences between the programs. And it would also allow VPI eligibility for 5-year-olds. This would allow placements of 5-year-olds in VPI classrooms who did not receive access to sufficient preschool experiences or may have are not ready for kindergarten, and so this would be on final placement, would be decided by the family and program leaders. Slide 16 details the supplemental programs. There's supplemental programs to increase the K-12 computer science initiative from the tech talent. You see the first line is transferring it to DOE's budget. The second line is increasing it, and that would bring it to $2.7 million annually for school divisions to provide computer science initiatives to students. There's supporting of the K through 8th grade STEM pipelines to introduce students to robotics and coding programs. There's $1 million to support students who are enrolled in computer science advanced placement courses and then them actually succeeding and passing the advanced placement course for those coursework for that course. Increasing diversity in the computer science teaching workforce. This would increase minority teachers by providing professional development and support to pass the praxis. There's support for the Virginia Air and Space Center for STEM education. There's increasing support for WHRO's content development, the eMedia Virginia program. There's continued support for the Blue Ridge PBS educational program. There's also support for the VPM curriculum and learning asset development. There's an increase of $1.5 million for communities and schools. That also is combined with a one-time development of a fund called Community Schools Fund, which would allow school divisions to partner with communities and schools or other partners to provide wraparound services. That's $10 million. There's increased support for the Wolf Trap STEM program of about $900,000, bringing them to about $1 million in the first year and $1.3 million in the second year. And then a few other programs for other entities providing K-12 services. I'm going to try to move through the next few slides on Department of Education. At the Department of Education, there's $1 million each year for the Virginia Kindergarten Readiness Program. This would expand it to all 3-year-olds and 4-year-olds who are in a public setting, and so we know how they are, if they're prepared for kindergarten based on the assessment. There's expansion of the classroom observation in early childhood. This is related to Senator Howe's unification legislation from 2020. There's $3.3 million in the first year and $6.5 million in the second year to expand the Office of School Quality. This office provides support to low-performing schools. This was a JLARC recommendation from last year, or sorry, from 2020. And that would provide the funding for that. There's proposal for $5 million to continue the support for the learning management system, which the General Assembly funded with federal K-12 relief funds. There's continue the support for the student growth assessments, which were also funded in the first year by the General Assembly with K-12 federal relief funds. There's funding for 2 FTEs to support the administration of the Virginia School Survey of Climate and Working Conditions. Expansion for early childhood education program. This is 2 FTEs for DOE to administer early childhood programs. There's $500,000 for DOE to study the potential for a STEM governor's school on the eastern shore of Virginia. There's 1 FTE to support social and emotional learning, training, and implementation resources for the Commonwealth. And then based on the marijuana legalization legislation from last year, there was a requirement for DOE to come up with resources for the harms of marijuana use for K-12 students. And then the second part of the table just shows the non-general fund actions, removing of any one-time COVID-19 relief funding that was appropriated. This has already been spent and doesn't need to be in their base budgets. Increasing the Child Care Development Fund. This is the child care subsidy since it's moved to DOE, just increasing it based on their federal appropriation. And then the Virtual Virginia non-general fund appropriations are just revenues from divisions enrolling their students in the Virtual Virginia program. That's DOE's virtual education system. And then slide 18 is just the language amendments at the Department of Education. The first one is related to the child care subsidy. This would eliminate the limits on the duration of time that families may participate in the child care subsidy program. This was a state mandate, and instead it would just take it to the maximum federal benefits for that program. Temporarily, the child care subsidy program. Currently, it's at 72 months for a family. So if a family utilized the child care subsidy program for 72 months, that is the duration of the time that they can receive that benefit. And this was implemented to control the number of students in the program, but DOE feels that they can do that by just adjusting their child targets. If their appropriations change, they just reduce how many students can be served. The next one is the child care cost estimation. This recommends language requiring DOE to develop a methodology to estimate the actual cost of providing high quality early childhood care and education services. And then the last bullet is for teacher recruitment and retention. We provided positions during the last General Assembly session to provide general funds to support special education teacher recruitment retention. This would just expand it to all teachers. This was a JLARC recommendation from their study in 2020 as well. The next few slides on federal K-12 relief funding are just repeats. I wanted to remind members just the amount of federal funds that were available. Divisions Virginia has received about $3.3 billion, and most of this went to divisions. 90% went directly to divisions, and they still can spend those monies until September 2024. One reason I bring it up is we have to meet a maintenance of effort requirement based on the law, so we will have to monitor any subsequent policy actions of the Finance Committee on if we're meeting that maintenance of effort. Senator Saslaw, that completes my presentation. If there's no questions, we can turn to UVA's Weldon Cooper.
Speaking to you all. I was asked to touch on 2 key points and how they'd affect public school enrollment in Virginia during this decade. One is birth trends in Virginia, and the other is the public school students who are missing since the pandemic began, particularly looking at where they've gone. I think to address these 2 points, one thing really important to spend some time looking at is the enrollment trends we saw in Virginia before the pandemic. Tyler touched on that a little bit initially in the presentation. If you looked at enrollment in Virginia before the pandemic, we had very steady growth. About 42,000 students were added on since 2010. That's a continuation of a trend we saw in Virginia for the last few decades, going back to the 1980s. When you go down below the state level, the picture is a lot more mixed. As many of you probably know, most school divisions in Virginia were declining enrollment during the period. Many of those dark blue ones, the rural ones, smaller ones. If you looked at the 50 smallest school divisions in Virginia, they declined by 10% during that 9-year period. There are some school divisions like Charles City County that lost closer to a quarter of their students in that 9-year period. But all that was outweighed by the growth we saw in the larger school divisions, particularly up in North Virginia, those green ones.
So they grew.
They grew quite a bit, more than to make up for it. The 10 large...
These numbers, Fairfax County is 15% of the total
Yeah,
public school enrollment.
that'll push everything up.
480,000 to 1.2 billion.
Just those 10 added 56,000 students, so more than made up for any loss you saw in the smaller ones. But if you looked at school level or grade level enrollment numbers in Virginia, there were some signs that that long period of growth we've seen in school enrollment in Virginia was about to start declining before the pandemic and enter a period of decline that really didn't seem to be any end to. The first sign of that was in 2013 when the kindergarten class size in Virginia was smaller than in 2012. The next year was even smaller and smaller the next year. As those smaller cohorts moved up, we started seeing Virginia's entire elementary school enrollment start declining on a statewide basis. And if the pandemic hadn't happened, we would have expected middle school enrollment in Virginia to be smaller than last year, just with those smaller cohorts moving up. And within a couple years, we would have expected high school enrollment in Virginia to start declining as well, pushing total public school enrollment declining. And that's something that we would have expected without a pandemic. By the end of this decade, we would have expected Virginia to lose about 50,000 public school students on a statewide level. The main reason why that decline was expected was because of the decline in births we started to see in Virginia in the late 2000s. Births aren't a perfect predictor of school enrollment, but they're typically the main one. Between 2007 and 2020, the number of births in Virginia went down 10%, which is about 11,000. And there's a pretty strong correlation. One example is the number of births in Virginia peaked in 2007. They started declining in 2008. 5 years later, kindergarten peaks in 2012, starts declining in 2013. So they correlate quite a bit. Another trend, actually one other point I'd make on that, just to think about when we're talking about projections. If you figure that births started declining in 2007 and we weren't expecting Virginia's public school enrollment to start declining without a pandemic till right around now, there's a long time lag between when births change and school enrollment changes. They're correlated, but there's a stretch. So if starting this year or next year there's an unexpected baby boom, I wouldn't expect that to shift, reverse that decline we're seeing in Virginia's public school enrollment until probably after 2030. It's going to be a while before we see it change direction. The pandemic's made that more complicated, but the main point is we were already expecting quite a bit of decline this decade, and I don't see a factor reversing that. The other trend that we saw in Virginia during the 2010s was fairly rapid growth in students being educated privately. Public school enrollment in Virginia grew 3% from 2010 to 2019. Private school enrollment went up 6%, and then, as Tyler mentioned this earlier, homeschool enrollment was growing quite rapidly, something we've seen in Virginia and across the country in recent decades. The result was the share of K-12 students in Virginia being educated privately rose during the 2010s. The share in public schools shrunk. There's an observation I've heard a lot of different people make about the pandemic, and that it seemed to accelerate a lot of trends that we saw happening beforehand. And you see that with e-commerce. We've looked a lot at telecommuting. It's definitely done that. And I think you can say to a certain extent it's done that with private education, definitely with homeschooling. It's really accelerated the growth we already saw going on beforehand. In the fall of 2021, there were probably about 44,000 fewer public K-12 students than would have been expected without a pandemic. I would say around 10% or so of those are kindergartners whose parents held them back. Most of the rest are probably evenly split between being in private school and homeschool. And I think one difficult question that's fairly important is how many of those students are going to come back to public school. If they don't come back, the enrollment decline in Virginia will be a lot steeper than we would have thought before the pandemic. Instead of losing 50,000 students, Virginia might have 100,000 students fewer by the end of this decade. There's definitely not a clear answer on how many are going to come back, but I think if you look at where the students are missing, Tyler mentioned this briefly earlier, it does give us an idea who's missing, and I think gives some hints what's going on. These are the missing students by grade in Virginia in the fall of 2020. You can see there's a strong correlation with age, typically younger, but I think it's really worth noting how many ninth graders are missing. That's a common period where people change schools. A lot of parents didn't enroll their children in public school. They kept them at home or they put them in a private school. So there's a lot fewer ninth graders in 2020 than we would have expected. There's also a lot fewer kindergartners, so the same sort of scenario. Parents didn't enroll their children in public school. So that's fall of 2020. When we look at the same chart for fall of 2021, we notice there's that age distribution there, but there's a lot fewer missing ninth graders, a lot fewer missing kindergartners. So one takeaway from that is 2020 was a bit of a one-off. A lot of parents readjusted, and ninth grade came up for their children. They enrolled a lot more than public school. So that may go in the idea that we're going to see some of a return to normal, more of these missing students going back to public school. The counter, though, is that those missing ninth graders are now in 10th grade, and they're still missing. The missing kindergartners in first grade, most of those are still missing. I think a lot of the students won't be coming back. I think one result you'll see after the pandemic is there'll be a larger number of children being educated privately than we saw before. Part of that acceleration.
Sure. But before we leave this slide, do you have any sense of, or does this also reflect students who may have repeated a grade rather than just didn't show up?
It's definitely based off of how schools report it, and some schools do report it differently in their fall count. That's definitely can be a factor in there, and I know we did a projection for one school division where it was quite complicated because some were repeating and some weren't, but it does vary how they addressed it for sure. I think there's a lot of questions there, and we're not going to know for sure. I think, though, the big factor that's going to be driving enrollment in Virginia the next decade is going to be births, and I think we can feel a lot more confident about that as well. This chart shows you the decline we've seen in births in Virginia across its three large metro areas, Hampton Roads, Northern Virginia, Richmond, and then the other parts of Virginia, the smaller metro areas and the rural ones. There's a number of different things going on here, but there are two trends I think are really worth highlighting. One is that yellow line, which is the more rural and smaller metro areas. You can see how initially births declined the most there after '07, and that's the same thing we saw on that initial map with school enrollment. They had the steepest declines in school enrollment, often those smaller rural ones. And that's because, in large part, because of that birth decline we saw after '07. The other trend really worth noting is Northern Virginia. Northern Virginia wasn't nearly as affected by births initially, the way the rest of Virginia was, and that's why we've seen that strong enrollment growth up until very recently there. But since 2016, Northern Virginia's births have really started to decline. Some of that is part of what we've seen in a lot of other urban areas in the U.S. I think a lot of that's also driven by the out-migration we're seeing from Northern Virginia, particularly young families, young adults who are just not having children there. And so that's really pulling down the number of births. I think in the next couple of years we're going to start seeing that affecting school enrollment, even without the pandemic. You know, I think that's a point to note about these birth numbers, is none of these were affected by the pandemic. These are all pre-pandemic. So unless there's a pretty incredible bounce back in Northern Virginia, that scale of decline would be enough to push their total public school enrollment into decline without a pandemic by the end of this decade. When you look at the change in births in Virginia since '07, it looks a lot like the map I showed you of school enrollment. We see the sharpest declines in births, often in those rural localities, southwest, south side, along the bay. But there are some differences from that enrollment map. One really jumps out to me is we've seen a bit of a bounce back in births in upper south side and parts of the valley. That may show up in school enrollment later on this decade. So while we may have statewide decline, there are some areas that may actually, who were declining, see the opposite, if these birth numbers are a good predictor. The other thing is Northern Virginia. Northern Virginia doesn't stand out with the growth the way it did on the first map. It looks a lot like the rest of Virginia. Fairfax County between 2016 and 2020 had a 15% decline in its births just in that 4-year period. Arlington had 18%. To put those in perspective, the Coalfields, which have had the steepest declines in school enrollment, had a 17% decline in births. Typically, when I'm looking at any data for Virginia, the Coalfields.
One more time.
Sure.
I heard you, but
So we had a 15% decline in births in Fairfax County between 2016 and 2020. Arlington had an 18%. The Coalfields, the 7 coal-producing counties, had a 17% decline in the same period. And you think about the Coalfields, the extent of enrollment loss they've had the last decade or two. If the births in Fairfax and Arlington are a predictor of enrollment, they're going to look a lot more like the Coalfields than they used to, at least when it comes to enrollment. They seem like they're in line to see some fairly substantial enrollment losses, which is a real change from what they've experienced in recent decades.
One of the things that you've got to consider that mitigates against that is the growth, the population growth that moves in. Just to give you an example, Tyson's Corner, I think it was in 2017, the board, or 16 or 17, the Board of Supervisors rezoned it to provide for 100,000 more people by 2030, like they didn't have enough there already. So,
They're not
I mean,
expecting kids.
huh?
They're not expecting many
Well,
kids in there.
They'll get
Many
some.
children.
They might.
Okay,
These are gonna be singles.
Yeah, no, you're right, but those people who are coming in are young and ultimately they're gonna have kids. Janet's
fewer
right
than they
about
used
that.
It's very hard to predict births for sure.
Yeah.
I think it's, if they can pull in more younger families that have been in Maryland or DC otherwise, the big issue I think a lot of people see in Northern Virginia is the cost of housing. That seems to be driving out a lot of young people. If they do build a ton of housing in Tyson's, that might fix that. Yeah, maybe you'll have more families and more children. Right now, looking at births, it's a really substantial decline, one that they hadn't had really up until the last couple of years, and it really does correlate with that outmigration we're seeing of young families.
Yeah.
Beltway and 995.
No, I think it is tricky because their population's growing, but it's that school age is the really good the point here.
I have a question. Yeah, and so reflected in this would also be, or we need to see a different analysis of migration patterns and the trend of more people waiting to have children and having children at older ages.
And the other thing again, as we talked about earlier, with the shift to private school, how, that extent, that's what goes into a division level enrollment projection, which is not a massive but a significant project. The births. The reason I put in these presentations is that there's something that we geocode, the Department of Health provides us, and I think they're the best predictor. But yes, it's a bunch of different factors when you run an actual model. And you definitely have some places with declining births that have lots of other things going in their favor. But you have 15% of students are in Fairfax County. It's going to take a lot of people moving in to shift that decline you see in births there, I think. So sort of bigger picture, when you look at fertility rates in Virginia, what's really been noticeable is how they've kept declining. I think there was an assumption in Virginia nationally by demographers, economists, that we saw that dip in births in the late 2000s that was caused by the recession. We were going to see a bounce back when the economy improved. But going into the pandemic, the U.S. had the longest period of uninterrupted economic growth in its history, but we kept seeing fertility rates going down. At this point, they're well below the 2.1 number you need to replace the population or replace students graduating from high school. Virginia is not unusual in this way. When you compare Virginia with the U.S., it's very similar. You compare Virginia with other developed countries, most of us are sitting right around 1.6, 1.7 children per woman. Some of that definitely could be the delay factor. I think that's something we really have been looking at. There was a big assumption that millennials entered the period where it's most common to have children in late 20s, early 30s. We'd see births coming up. It hasn't happened yet. And there's a certain point you hit where it's not going to happen. And I think it's something demographers are watching pretty carefully. If there isn't a baby boom in the next couple of years, you can get into sort of a spiral where it becomes harder and harder. You have smaller and smaller generations below it. It's very hard to get out of that spiral. That's what Japan and Eastern Europe have been in for the last couple of decades, and we're sort of where they were a couple decades ago. And I think a point to think about with that is that a trend like this isn't going to stay just in public schools. You'll have a shrinking college-age population potentially. You'll have community colleges and universities competing for a smaller pool. You also may have a shrinking workforce as well, or at least a shrinking working age population. So I've gone through some slides here. There's just a couple points. If I didn't get them across, I'd like to make sure I did. The main one really was this point that we would have expected public school enrollment in Virginia to decline without a pandemic. The pandemic has made that more complicated, but the factors were already there on a statewide level to expect a fairly substantial decline over this decade. The other I mentioned is it does seem as if the pandemic has boosted private school enrollment, homeschool enrollment in Virginia. It's going to be higher after the pandemic than it was before. The point I made initially about births and their influence on enrollment, there's a strong one, but if we have a baby boom, it's not going to be enough by itself to change the expected enrollment decline. There's way too much of a lag. It wouldn't happen until the 2030s. So that won't change what we're going to see during the rest of this decade. If we had something on the scale of the economic development in Northern Virginia after September 11th, that could change it, but it would have to be something like that. And the last point I made there is that we're going to probably see a lot of different side effects from the decline of births just well outside of schools. I think you think about all the weird side effects of the pandemic economically. If you have a shrinking working age population, you're going to see a lot of other very odd surprises as well, I think. Thank you.
And I get, Mr. Chair. And to that point, I think it's worth noting one of the surprising reasons for the workforce shortage now, and I think this portends in the future, is the large number of boomers who are still in the workforce who are retiring. And so that's going to be a second or third effect of what we see here is K-12 enrollment, higher ed enrollment, and workforce.
Seems like we're just starting to enter into that. I think the shortages people are seeing right now are just a bit of a taste of what we're going into potentially.
How do you, they show like in Prince William, Loudoun County over the last 20, 30 years, their populations have more than doubled. Like, sooner or later, got to show up at the school system.
It is, I would say that, if you look at births in Virginia,
Both over 400,000 in Prince William's approaching 500,000.
yeah. Well, maybe zooming out, if you think about Virginia as a whole, and I'd have to go back and check these numbers, but I think most of the growth we've seen in Virginia in the last decade and most of the growth this decade, I believe, has been the population over 65. I'd have to check that, but in the population that's over age 65. So it's those baby boomers living longer, a large generation. So you do have a lot of growth, but a lot of it are people who are not in elementary school anymore, or middle school.
Don't laugh, you're not far away.
With the immigrant population, you're finding that their birth rates are becoming the same as those of us native born?
Well, I think one thing that's really happened has been a shift. Up until the early mid 2000s, a lot of the immigration, particularly to Virginia, but into the U.S. in general, it was disproportionately from Central America. It was lower skilled. A lot of people would start families. The immigration we see now is more likely to be coming from China, India. Those fertility rates were low for them. They're still low. And it's interesting also, immigration we're getting from Central America is increasingly higher skilled, which again, typically smaller families. So their fertility rates aren't changing, but I think the mix of immigrants we're getting in Virginia nationally has changed quite a bit. Thank you. And my email's up there. You're welcome to shoot me an email if you have any questions.
Senator Saslaw and members, that's all that I have for you today. Yes, but if you'd like to have a discussion, you are welcome to.